Alright, welcome back to another RC Worst video. Today we're going to reference back to a video that we did recently of how long should a pressure tank last. And I kind of trash talked cheap steel tanks, and I kind of trash talked anything that really isn't WellXTrol, including fiberglass tanks. And we had a number of people that kind of didn't like that, and they kind of thought the video that we did was more of an advertisement for WellXTrol because I didn't really explain why I came to that conclusion and why you should spend the money on WellXTrol tanks. So we're going to today take a look at the WellXTrol tank, and I'm going to point out all the little features and little benefits that went into the engineering and design of this tank that all add up to a by far superior tank, and kind of put some context into that video that I did. You know, I probably should have included at least a little more information in that video, but in this video we're going to get right down to it. So let's jump into it. First thing I want to point out with WellXTrol tanks is that they're steel. They're not stainless steel, but the connection for where you actually hook into the tank is stainless steel, so you're not going to have corrosion there. And then any surface that potentially could come in contact with corrosion, or could corrode, I guess is a better way to say that, has this coating on it. They use a Tuf-Kote coating rather than just simple paint. So the Tuf-Kote is commonly used in applications like waterproofing decks and concrete. It's sprayed underneath cars to prevent corrosion and rust, and I can't think of a much more rough environment than underneath a vehicle where you're driving over salt and water and all of these different materials and chemicals that are on the roadways. And I couldn't find any other tank manufacturer that uses a product to further protect the base coat of paint. So it's superior in that regard. You're really never going to have rust issues. Obviously, over time, if it gets a dent in it or a scratch in it, you can develop rust, and we've seen that plenty of times. But one thing I've never seen is a pressure tank, a WellXTrol pressure tank, fail due to rust. It always ends up being the bladder. I've seen some pretty rusty ones that are 30 years old and have been sitting out in the middle of a field, but it's generally never the rust that causes the failure. It's just the bladder finally goes bad, and that's a good thing. So on to the next point. So one of the things that's also nice about the WellXTrol is, and this actually is pretty common in other steel tanks as well, but not the same material, is there's a liner in here in this bottom section. So if you're not familiar with how the tanks work, the water fills up this lower section and it expands this bladder that we've got here to provide the pressure action, and then it's all air up in the top chamber. But anyways, there's this liner in the WellXTrol tanks that is unique. It's an antimicrobial or antibacterial liner, so that it doesn't get any growth, bacterial growth on it. It's all neutralized on contact, and that's a nice feature. You obviously don't want, you know, sometimes you have a pressure tank indoors, so if you don't run the water for a while, the temperature can get up to essentially room temperature, which makes it a good area for bacteria and so forth. So that antibacterial liner is going to increase the safety factor in terms of the drinkability of the water. Another very unique feature is the Turbulator, which is this little white deal. It's kind of hard to reach, or maybe hard to see. This little white deal that is on the inlet. Now that's a patented feature of the WellXTrol tanks. So that feature, the Turbulator, is actually a very awesome feature. So what it does is, as the water comes into the tank, it causes the water to be more turbulent as it comes in. So anytime you get a little bit of sediment, so if you get a little sand or dirt or grit or whatever inside of the pressure tank, that Turbulator makes the water slosh all around inside of the tank here, and it helps to keep sediment from accumulating. It helps to cause it to flush out every time, or at least kind of change positions so you don't get buildup, which is going to ultimately cause premature tank failure. If you get a lot of sand and sediment built up in your tank, eventually it's going to get in the creases and the cracks of the bladder, and then as the bladder expands and contracts, the sand will rub on those sections, and then it'll cause that bladder to fail. Another big reason that WellXTrol tanks are fantastic is you've got a butyl diaphragm. So this diaphragm is butyl. A lot of the other manufacturers use polypropylene, which polypropylene is just a cheaper material. Butyl is pretty expensive. They use it in a lot of processes like car tire inner tubes, and it's used in a variety of industrial applications where you need that elasticity, but you also need durability. Butyl doesn't really break down, and so it makes it a really good product for these situations. Another thing about these tanks is the WellXTrol uses a very thick diaphragm. It's 3/16 of an inch thick, which is, you know, greater than 1/8 of an inch, which makes it a pretty thick bladder. I mean, if I grab a section of this and pinch it down, you've got about 1/4 of an inch between the two sides. So, you know, that's about just a little bit greater than 1/8 of an inch thickness on that bladder. So thickest bladder in the industry. There's not anybody out there that has a thicker one. And if you go looking, and I encourage you to do research on whatever tank you're considering, most manufacturers don't publish the thickness. I actually had to grab a set of calipers and measure this tank, just to get a good idea of kind of what our baseline is. So another thing that's important is the pressure rating on these tanks. The WellXTrol brand boasts 150 PSI working pressure. Commonly with fiberglass tanks, for example, you're going to have about 125 is about as high as you're going to see. So pretty good. Most people aren't running their pressure tanks that high, or their operating is not that high. And then another thing, like a cheaper brand of steel tank, like what some of the big box stores sell, they're usually about 100 PSI. I've seen some, that seems to be the benchmark. But what I find interesting, and I think it contributes to the pressure rating of these tanks, is if we work our way up here a little bit. So another unique thing that WellXTrol has is this is a secondary dome that's inside of the tank here. It's steel, and what this does is it provides a barrier that limits the expansion of the bladder. So a lot of comparable steel tanks that you'll find in big box stores and so forth don't have this barrier here, so it's possible to overexpand the bladder and then cause it to tear. So what adds a lot of reliability to WellXTrol tanks is the fact that it's going to be really tough for the bladder to overstretch because it just has nowhere that it can go. Whereas in a traditional tank, especially as you get the larger tanks where you've got more air volume, it would be really easy to overpressurize the system. For example, the pressure switch gets stuck on, or you've got problems elsewhere in the system, a ball valve gets left closed. Anyways, a submersible pump specifically can build up tremendous pressures, and it would be really easy to, for example, a comparable steel tank with 100 PSI rating, you know, if you're operating at 40-60, that's only another 40 PSI before you pop the thing. Whereas with a WellXTrol tank, chances are if your system was sized within reason, you're probably not even going to be able to build up to 150 PSI unless you've got kind of a unique type of a system. So another layer of reliability that went into the design of this tank. So let's talk for a minute about the Schrader valve, or where you actually fill the tank up with air. Now it does come pre-charged, but another important thing about this is welded in here, so there's no seam, no area that you could remove this. It's permanently installed here. Now that is a huge advantage over both competitive steel tanks as well as fiberglass tanks, where they typically are not welded in. Like I know on a lot of fiberglass tanks, there's the bladder of the fiberglass tank is actually attached to the Schrader valve, and then this just penetrates through the top. And we're going to go out in the yard in just a minute and take a look at a couple fiberglass tanks as well as an off-brand steel tank, and I'll show you what I mean. But the fact that it penetrates through, if you were to, in a fiberglass tank, have your bladder fail and then it fills up with water, and then the Schrader valve is not sealed very well because it's just a nut or a washer holding it in place, you could potentially have a huge leak. And if you have the pressure tank in your basement and you just have water pouring all over the place and you don't realize you have a problem, you could have a flooded basement just because your pressure tank bladder blew. Whereas with a WellXTrol tank, there's really nowhere that the water could make its way out of the system, and even if it did, through the Schrader valve, let's say your tank went bad by the bladder breaking and your Schrader valve was bad, which is extremely unlikely, you would have a very, very, very small amount of water that could actually pass through this thing. So it wouldn't be the end of the world. It would be a lot more limited, though those two things happening at the same time is practically impossible. So another thing that's a benefit to the WellXTrol tanks is they've got a 200-degree operating temperature. Most folks aren't dealing with those higher water temperatures, but there are people that have thermal pockets where their well water comes out quite hot and has to go into cooling tanks, what have you. But that higher operating temperature just lends itself to the argument that it's built with more quality materials than comparable tanks. So I looked at some fiberglass tanks and I looked at some other off-brand steel tanks, and none of them were even close to 200. I think the fiberglass is about 100 degrees, and I think that the other steel tank I was looking at was about 150 degrees. So a pretty significant difference when you look at the difference between 100 and 200. So in the instance that your tank is left outside by the wellhead, what have you, if it's a hot sunny day and your pressure tank can only handle 100 degrees, you might be exceeding the temperature limit of the tank if you're not running any water, and that'd be kind of a goofy way to have tank failure. Or even if it's in like a pump house. Oftentimes, you walk into your pump house in the middle of summer, it's like 10-20 degrees hotter than it is outside if you don't have a lot of ventilation in there. So again, you could run into a situation where the pressure tank, just based on the ambient air temperature, is outside of its operating range, and that's, with a fiberglass tank, I think you could run into some pretty bad problems. If you exceed the temperature rating, things are going to start falling apart. And before I go on to my next point, one thing that really bugs me about a lot of fiberglass tanks that I've seen is the connections to your system are all plastic. That's terrible in my opinion, because if you've got the choice of steel or stainless steel or plastic, why would you choose plastic on something that's pressurized, that has a lot of water running through it? It just seems like a poor move when you could use metal, and then you don't have a weak link in the system. So anyways, on to warranties. WellXTrol has the leading warranty, 7 years. So anything happens to your tank, fails due to a defect, you get a 7-year warranty on it, and that's fantastic. I think the fiberglass tanks I was looking at had a 2-year warranty, and the other steel tank I was looking at had a 5-year warranty. But when you look at like some of these steel tanks that are manufactured in China or what have you, like what you would buy at a big box store, it may be a couple $100 cheaper than the WellXTrol, and it may have a 5-year warranty, but look into how you go about getting the warranty. I know with WellXTrol, it's very, very simple. You just get a hold of us if you bought it from us, or you get a hold of whoever you bought it from, and then they submit it for warranty. It's an American company that gets the warranties processed really quickly and either gets you a credit or gets you a new tank. Oftentimes it's a new tank. I've dealt with situations with folks that had tanks manufactured overseas, and it had a warranty, but good luck figuring out where to submit the warranty and actually get the warranty taken care of. So that's a pretty big deal. You know, they can sell you on the fact that it's got this long warranty, but I can speak from experience that the WellXTrol tank warranty process is simple. They're pretty easy going on it. They're not going to tear your tank apart bit by bit and figure out some way to get out of it. So that's important when it comes to evaluating the parts of your system. Now, you know, fiberglass tanks, 2-year warranty, you know, chances are that it's probably not going to fail in 2 years, even if it's the worst tank on the market. But 7 years, that's a lot of time. That's a lot of water gone through the system, and you could run into problems, and getting a new tank would be great. All right, so the last point that I want to make before we head out to the yard, and I just point out a few of the things that I mentioned. When it comes to price, WellXTrol tanks, you know, depending on the markup that the guy you're buying it from is putting on it, but basically they're pretty dang competitive, especially when you add up all the little things. You know, I put a cheaper tank right next to this tank. They may look identical, but all the little things, the welded Schrader valve, the expansion limiting device, the bio or antibacterial liner, all these different things, they add up to a much better product, and the price is not that different. A couple $100s for years and years longer without having to worry about a component in your system, one of the most important systems arguably in your house, which is water. So spending an extra couple $100, an extra 10, 20, 15% compared to the cheapest of the cheap you can find, this is well worth it when it comes to, and it's an investment in your property. So anyways, let's head outside. I'll take a look at a couple fiberglass tanks, take a look at a cheaper steel tank, and just kind of point out some of the inferior aspects of those kind of compared to the WellXTrol tank. So, all right, so we've got a plastic fiberglass tank. We just tipped it over just to show you. Here's the discharge, or the inlet, I guess it's the same thing, the connection. So basically it's all plastic. It wouldn't take much to have that break if you were to hit it with something or drop a wrench on it or over tighten something and have it crack. So if I had a choice, I would rather go with metal, steel, because it's just going to last longer. It's not going to break. So that's that. Okay, so you can see here's the top of this tank where you would adjust the air pressure. There's a nut that actually holds this in place. So that's what I was talking about when I said that if your bladder were to fail in this tank, you could very likely have a leak right there that floods your basement. So here's a steel tank, and they've kind of got this funny little gasket here, like that's going to keep the water back. But this one also is not welded in place. It's just a compression fitting that just fits in there. So once again, not quite as good as the WellXTrol brand. Now another thing, and I apologize if it's a little windy out here, that I didn't mention is a lot of the fiberglass tank manufacturers like to boast that their tanks are a lot lighter in weight, when in reality it's only about 30%. So maybe a steel tank weighs 100 pounds and the fiberglass equivalent weighs 70 pounds. So not a terrible difference in weight, and you know, you only put it in one time, and if you buy the right one, it's going to last you 20 years. You know, what does that weight difference really mean to you? It doesn't mean a whole lot to me. Okay, so one other thing to touch on is in some fiberglass tanks, the bladder is actually replaceable, and it's kind of more a selling point, in my opinion, because replacing the bladder in these tanks is not an easy thing to do, and it will take time. When you're looking at the cost of labor, especially if you don't plan on doing it yourself, putting a new tank in and paying someone to do that is probably going to be cheaper than all the time and labor that they're going to spend in replacing that bladder. And I almost would bet money that any place that sells these fiberglass tanks doesn't stock the bladders. So they're going to talk you in, they're going to sell you on the fact that it's got a bladder that can be replaced, and then you're going to call them back to buy a new bladder, and they're going to sell you a new tank, or try to sell you a new tank instead of a bladder, because you're going to have to wait a week, 2 weeks to get the bladder anyways. I almost would bet money that that's how that happens. There's some videos online of people replacing bladders on these things. Don't have to tell you how to find those, but it doesn't look easy. It looks time consuming, and I read through the instructions. It's a total cluster. So yeah, the bladder is replaceable, but at what cost and how much time and effort? And I'm not sold on it. All right, so that's about our video today. Thanks for joining me. And in the last video, we talked about how long pressure tanks should last. So if you get a good quality tank, for example, a WellXTrol tank, not saying there aren't other quality tanks on the market, but I'm pretty sold on WellXTrol tanks, and that's what I sell. So, you know, a WellXTrol tank could easily last you 10, 15, 20, 30 years. A cheaper tank could go bad in 2 days. So, you know, really it depends on a lot of circumstances. A lot of conditions can change in different systems. But if you buy a quality product that's been around a long time, has a lot of thought in the engineering and processing of bringing that product into production like WellXTrol does, you can have a lot of confidence that it's going to last probably longer than any other component in the system. So thanks for joining us today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will catch you next time.